My name is Jonathan Hale, and for 18 years I have watched the mind do its quiet acrobatics behind faces that pretend to be still. I trained in Cambridge, where the river seemed to hold its breath through winter, and finished my residency in Boston, where the corridors of our hospitals smell faintly of paper and disinfectant. I am 46 now. I have learned to sit in a chair without fidgeting, to let silence broaden until it reveals its edges, to hear the tremor under a sentence and follow it back to its source. I believed, for most of my career, that there were limits. Elastic perhaps, but boundaries nonetheless, beyond which symptoms turned into stories, and stories into myths. I believed in blood tests, inventory, differential diagnoses arranged like neat drawers in a cabinet only I could open. My office is on the 7th floor, a long rectangle with a single narrow window that frames a slice of gray sky like a specimen. The carpet gives a little when you stand, as if the building were breathing. There is a clock that ticks louder than it should. I never replace it because the sound is useful. Patients measure themselves against it without knowing. On the bookshelf, case reports, dog-eared monograph, a metronome. On the wall, my state license and a photograph of the ocean taken in February. A horizon so flat it almost hums. Routine keeps me steady. Notes typed immediately after sessions. Coffee at the same time each day. A walk down the same hall at dusk. Past the vending machines and the elevators that sigh when they close. I am not a romantic about my work. I do not call my patients souls. I know what grief does to the body. I have seen the way memory edits itself, cutting and splicing until a life looks like a clean line instead of a knot. I was the child who organized his toy soldiers by height and then by shade of green, who polished his trumpet even when the mouthpiece already gleamed. Order felt like kindness. When my mother died, suddenly, in a church parking lot when I was 19, I discovered that order is also a door you can lock from the inside. I locked it. Then I finished medical school. At night, when most of the inpatient unit is finally quiet, I sometimes walk the service stairwell to the basement records. Old files wait down there, crisp and sour with dust. A small archive of afternoons that once burned like cities. The fluorescent lights make a sound like distant insects. People imagine psychiatry as a theater of shouting and sudden epiphany. The truth is that most of it is patient, nearly monastic. The slow harvest of patterns from days that interchangeable. I prefer it that. If something moves in the periphery, you can feel it. On a Monday in late October, the head nurse left a thin manila folder on my chair before I arrived. I noticed it because she never does that. She hates when paper escapes the chart room. The folder was unmarked on the tab. Inside were 3 pages. No intake narrative, only a scanned note from a community clinic upstate. A name, age, a line about dissociative episodes beginning in childhood, and a request for transfer to our care. In the margin, someone had written a single sentence in a hurried hand. Patient insists he is not alone. I closed the folder and set it beneath the clock, where the ticking seemed to lean toward, counting something I could not yet name. They brought him in just before noon, a tall man with a winter pallor and shoulders that did not agree with one. He stood a moment in the doorway as if measuring the shape of my room against a drawing he carried in his head. I asked him to sit. He lowered himself into the chair with the care of a person setting something fragile on a shelf. His name, the one on the file, did not seem to fit him. When I spoke it, he glanced to the left and then the right, as if to ask permission from either side. "Tell me what brings you," I said. "We do," he answered, and the pronoun did not feel theatrical. It arrived plain, like weather. His eyes were a pale, startled blue, the color of winter glass. Up close, I saw the faint half-moons on his wrists, that old bindings, long-heeled and almost shy. He noticed my notice and rotated his hands so the marks faced his lap. He described nights without edges. "I wake up standing," he said, "or I wake up with the taste of bark and I don't own any trees." He smiled to apologize for the sentence. When he spoke about sleep, his mouth weakened, as if the word itself weighed something. The clock behind him clicked. I asked about childhood, and he inhaled once. Shallow, like a diver, unsure of the water's depth. "There was a house in Maine," he said. "It leaned into a line of pines. At night the hallway made a sound like it had wind living in it." He paused. "I wasn't the only child, but the other one never sat at the..." He didn't elaborate. He watched the window as if expecting the sky to answer. I have heard metaphors wear the costume of truth. This was different. His language sat in the middle of the room like a small, damp bundle. When his gaze drifted past me to a corner where there was only wall, the air thinned almost imperceptibly. He was not searching. He was listening. "He doesn't like the light. He says the light separates us, and he wants us together." The voice that said it was his, but too patient, like he was repeating a rule learned long ago. I asked who he was. Elliot pressed his hands under his thighs, anchoring himself to the chair. "He has my name," he said. "He has my breath when I sleep." I guided him to sensation, to anchor. The chair under him, the floor holding the chair, the smell of coffee cooling on my desk. He followed, but only part way. When I was 7, he said, the porch door would be open in the morning. I would have dirt on my toes and pine needles in my hair, and my father would ask me if I went looking. Looking for what? I asked. He stared at the grain of the wooden armrest. For the rest of me, he said. He did not cry. He did not rage. He spoke like a man inventorying a house after a flood, naming what remained, skipping what the water had carried off. When we ended, I offered next week's appointment. He stood, but did not reach for. He will come before I do, he said. And then, almost kindly, don't turn off your light. After he left, the room kept the shape of him the way a lake keeps the memory of a boat. I did not turn off the lamp. I sat and wrote my notes in the quiet that settles after a name has divided the air, and when the page was full, I left the file on my desk, with its mouth slightly open, as if the folder were. Evening found the window turning to mirror. The city blurred into a smear of sodium lights, and the long arterial glow of the highway. I stood, then sat again, then stood once more. Routine prefers clean edges. Doubt softens them. I locked the door and went home with the sensation that the building watched me go. Sleep did not take me. At 2, I drove back. The corridors were emptied of voices. The elevator hummed as if remembering a song. My lamp was no longer on. I felt the small reprimand of that detail, memory's arrogance, before the switch clicked and the shade bloomed amber. The clock on the shelf had stopped at 2:17 and would not be persuaded. Every room has a second door you only find by accident. Mine opened a little, not with sound but with a change in density, as if someone had added an invisible piece of furniture to the corner. I opened the folder to steady myself with paper. 3 pages, and then a 4th I did not recall, a pale photocopy of a pediatric note from a county clinic in Maine, dated when Elliot would have been 7, night wandering. Porch door open at dawn. Dirt under nails. Father reports searching behavior. Patient uses phrase, go looking. The handwriting was precise in the way of people who fear their letters might escape them. A line at the bottom, recommend additional locks. Consider sleep study. Mother declines. The margin bore a thumbprint, smudged with something the copier had read as gray. I phoned the number on the header out of habit, and got a machine in a building that had long ago chosen new tenants. I set the receiver down and listened. The room had adopted a second breath, faint and unsynchronized with mine. I numbered the objects aloud. Desk, chair, window, lamp, to tie the air to things. Behind me, the metronome I never use began, very softly, to tick. It wasn't wound. I watched it move with the careful attention one gives a sleeping child. The ticking did not quicken or slow. It simply added a new layer to time. When I reached to still it, the glass of the window offered back my hand, and beyond that, a blackness that felt nearby. The pain was cold. Where my palm had pressed, a ghost of condensation gathered and then separated into a pattern like needles blown against snow. Pine suggested itself and then retreated, as if unwilling to be named. On the desk, the photocopy curled at the corner without draft. I wrote in my notes, maintain light overnight. Assess for malingering of environment. Absurd phrase, but my vocabulary prefers the floorboards. I left the lamp burning, locked the door, and walked into the hallway's hush. Something dry crackled under my shoe. I stooped with the reflex of a man collecting evidence he does not yet want. In my hand lay a small brown sliver, with a green thread still clinging to it, a thing that smelled faintly, impossibly, of resin and winter. I set it on the folder and did not turn off my light. He returned 2 days later with a thrift store coat and a distant weather working itself across his face. I had kept the brown sliver on my desk in a specimen envelope I once used for hair, labeled it without thinking. Pine? He noticed the envelope and smiled with only one side of his mouth, as if we had agreed on a private joke, and he was tired of keeping it. I asked whether the previous night had held. He was quiet, Elliot said. Quiet the way basements are quiet. The words settled between us like stairs turning downward. I set a blank sheet in front of him and nudged a pencil across the desk. Show me the house. He drew quickly, with the impatience of remembered geography. A rectangle for the kitchen, a thin hallway that pinched just before the stairs, a square he shaded heavier until the paper bruised. Here, he said. The door that isn't a door if you say so out loud. He added a hook-and-eye latch. His hand slowed, then pressed harder. It sings when it closes. What's downstairs? Cold air, he said, and then softer, us. I asked him to breathe with the paced cadence that steadies a drowning mind. He followed, counting under his breath, and the counting became a child's rhythm, the kind that sees the world in fours. He brings the chair out first, Elliot said. The straps make a polite sound when his eyes had not moved from the darker square on the. There's a smell like birthday candles after you blow them out, but the day isn't yours. His tongue touched his lip as if tasting smoke. He says stillness is a kind of listening. He says if we are very still, the other boy will arrive. What does your father say? Elliot's face altered without changing. Not another person. Only a rearrangement of gravity. Father says nothing. He looks at the wall where the marks are. He doesn't say the marks are wrong. He says the wall is doing its best. His throat works. Mother waits at the top of the stairs and hums the kitchen clock. The lamp dimmed and brightened as if finding breath. The metronome on the shelf offered one measured tick and fell quiet again. I kept my own voice flat. What are the marks? They are not letters, he said. They are corners. He pinched the air, turning his fingers as though fitting a shape into another shape. When the corners line up, he says, the door behind the door opens. He tells me I will stop feeling split when I learn the trick. A small white crescent had appeared on his wrist where circulation he did not seem to notice. Ground, I said. 5 things you can see. He looked as if peering through water. Your lamp, he said. The envelope with the tree in it. The window pretending to be night in the daytime. The pencil. He hesitated. The other pencil? There was no other pencil. The room cooled in a way that does not belong to building. I shifted my chair an inch, reclaiming the plain angles of furniture. 4 things you can touch, I said. He gripped the chair arms. Leather, he whispered. Wood. My shirt. Him. His fingers tightened until the knuckles blanched. He's taller in the dark. We counted down to 1. When he surfaced, sweat had purled along his hairline as neatly as stringed beads. He blinked hard, as if light were a pressure. I offered water. He shook his head. If I drink, he said, it tastes like downstairs. Our time was nearly done. He folded the drawing with impossible care and slid it into his coat. At the door he paused, wrists exposed for a heartbeat. A faint red band had risen where none had, perfectly circular, a history written fresh. He did not look at it. When you go home, he said, leave a light in the hall. It makes him choose. Then he was gone, and the envelope on my desk had leaked the smallest drift of green onto the paper, as if the question inside had learned to breathe. I scheduled an overnight observation in the quiet room, the one with the recessed camera and the bland wallpaper. There's nothing. He signed the consent without reading it, tracing each letter as though it were a path worn by feet. He likes rooms that forget themselves, Elliot said, almost apologetic. I asked the nurse to leave the corridor light on. The switch clicked with a meek certainty that felt like ritual. Electrodes dotted his scalp and chest, their wires gathered in a braid, a small anatomy of vigilance spread across the blanket. The monitor graph breathed in pale green hills. At 1:48 a.m., his pulse slowed into a disciplined valley. Respiration eased. The camera showed the gentle lift of fabric with each breath. I took notes in the dark, the pen scratching quietly, an insect at work under bark. At 2:03, he murmured the number 4 times. Then the room exhaled a scent exactly like extinguished candle. The nurse glanced at me as if I had brought the smell with my thoughts. The monitor line held steady. The corridor light, visible through the narrow pane in the door, did not waver. It only seemed farther away. He spoke again, voice thinned to a thread. Stillness is listening. His mouth barely moved. The microphone captured a second tone underneath, lower, softened by distance, no louder than a fold-in cloth. He lifted his hands in sleep and turned the wrists outward, presenting them to an invisible inspection. A faint ring began to blush around the skin, rising as steadily as frost takes a window. There were no restraints in the room. Regulations forbid them without cause. I wrote that sentence as if writing it could make the marks retreat. At 2:17, the timestamp jittered and then corrected itself. My throat tightened in a way I would later call reflux. Elliot sat up without the shuttle of muscles that usually declare the body's effort. The motion had the smooth patience of underwater things. He faced the corner where the wallpaper pattern repeats a small mistake. He is early, he said. The microphone stalled for a single breath and returned with the softest metallic sound. A meeting of something with something, polite and final. The corridor light did not go out, but the space between it and our door acquired depth. I counted the fixtures: camera, monitor, lamp, chair. The list arrived incomplete. Something in the air suggested a fifth object without offering a shape. On the screen, a vertical smear rose from the floor and resolved into the shadow of the IV stand, though there was no IV. Cable, I thought. Cable disguised as Omen. I reached for the intercom and said his name. He turned his head, but not his eyes. He says if we line up the corners, he whispered. No one will have to choose. By 3 o'clock, the rings on his wrists had faded to the suggestion of memory. He slept. The graph kept time like a cautious drummer. Dawn scraped pale along the blinds. When I lifted the blanket to free the braided wires, a green filament clung to the cotton. Too slender for thread, too fragrant for... Resin lived in it when I brought it to my face. The low ache of winter trees. Elliot woke as children do, in one piece all at once, and smiled at the door. He waited, he said. He stood at the light and counted. Then he looked at me with an interest that did not feel like his, and I realized I had written the same note 10 times in the margins. Keep the hallway light on. The morning after observation, I reviewed the footage alone, pausing where the timestamp had stuttered. and letting the freeze frame hold his face in that not-quite-awake stillness. Paper steadies me. I printed stills, clipped them to the file, and phoned the defunct clinic again, out of habit. A recorded voice gave me a number for a retired pediatrician who now answered from a kitchen with birds outside. She remembered a boy who came in smelling faintly of sap. Mother declined the sleep study, she said. Father was devout about something not named in church. Before we hung up, she emailed a scan from an old assessment, a child's drawing of a stair, a square room, and a door made of 2 right angles touching, labeled in shaky letters, corners. In the bottom margin, a grown hand had discouraged basement game. I brought blocks into the session, the kind used in play therapy. He was 32. He watched me build the hallway, the pinch before the stairs, the square I left bare. The hook is here, he said, placing his finger on the air just above the table. You can't see it until the lights know you're looking. I asked for a birthday from childhood. He chose 7. His mouth went soft at edges. I had 2 cakes. One upstairs with icing and cousins. One downstairs with no singing. Only the sound the matches make when you pinch them out. What did you wish for? To stop choosing, he said, and the answer sat between us like a coin no one wanted to touch. We built the basement in silence. He arranged 4 candles on the table's corners. I had brought only 3. The 4th rolled from the pocket of his thrifted coat as if I had put it there. He did not seem surprised. Father says stillness is how we learn to hear the other boy arrive, he whispered. Mother hums the time so we don't fall out of it. He lifted his sleeves. The bands on his wrists were colorless now, only a suggestion. When he stands in the doorway, he is taller than doors are. What happens when he arrives? The corners line, he said. He says my edges get tired of edges. He says if they learn to meet, I will be one thing. I asked about rules. Every childhood world has rules that keep it from tearing. He named them without pause. Do not look at the window after midnight. Do not name the space between the light and the door. Count to 4 twice when you stand. Breathe in time with the clock. If the hook shows itself, pretend it is air. He touched the table. Do not say who is we. I tried containment, the gentle fence of the present. Chair, rug, lamp, the sound of traffic braided with winter. He held the fence for 3 breaths, released it. When I was 7, he said, Father drew the corners wrong and the room corrected it. It made a sound like the chair does when you tighten the strap too far. He apologized to the wall. He never apologizes to me. I thought of the scanned drawing, the tidy caution in the adult script. Discourage basement games. I thought of the green filament on the blanket, the resin that found me by the nose. I asked if anyone else had ever seen the other boy. Elliot's face arranged itself around an old answer. My mother said not to look or he would enter, he murmured, but she was looking when she said it. When he left, the blocks remained in their map of downstairs. I took a photograph and slid the pieces back into their wooden tray. Under my chair, 2 needles lay at a clean right angle, joined like a small hinge, and I did not step on them. I set them with the envelope on my desk, where the sap darkened the paper in the shape of a quiet, patient corner. I left the blocks photo on my desk and took the rule home with me like medicine. Leave a light in the hall. My apartment is narrow, a corridor pretending to be a home, with the bedroom at one end and the kitchen at the other, as if my life were a question stretched between 2 answers. I set the lamp on the console table and let it glow a patient. The clock above the stove kept a stubborn time. Pipes tapped once somewhere in the building and then adopted the silence of people who do not wish to be involved. I performed the inventory I give to others. Chair, rug, coat hook, framed map, the thin vase with its single branch, and felt order settle like dust. At 2:17, the stove clock blinked once and forgot 1 minute. The way a person forgets a step and then pretends they meant it. The hall lamp dimmed without losing courage. A smell arrived that knew me, that post-birthday candle breath, sweet and used. I counted to 4 twice, my own voice very small in my chest. The walls were not moving, but their corners leaned toward one another like old friends who recognize a story beginning. In the glass of the framed map, a figure shaped itself out of hallway and light, only because corners had decided to be generous. I didn't look at the space between the lamp and the door. I looked at the brass knob until it was nothing but metal. My phone vibrated on the console, a soft insect. Voicemail, Elliot's voice, rimmed with sleep. He found a new corner, he said. In the background, a child counted 4 exactly 4 times, not louder than someone testing a whisper. Come in the morning. He wants you to see the chair. His building was a narrow brick that had once been a store. The lobby smelled of mop water and thrift. He had taped his window seams with brown paper in small crosses that made the light look disciplined. He says the apartment is too square, Elliot said, apologizing for geometry. On the table, he set 4 stubs of candle, each a different height, as if time had been cut at 4 unequal moments. He placed them at the corners, left one slightly out of true. When they listened to each other, he murmured. The room answers. He nudged the shy candle until it agreed. The air changed temperature not by degrees but by intention. The table creaked as furniture does when a tall person leans on it, though no one. A quiet metallic confluence sounded from nowhere, the cousin of the noise a hook makes when it meets an eye. Elliot rolled his sleeves. The skin at his wrists rose like dawn on a small horizon. He shut his eyes as if to keep something inside them. I reached and moved a candle half an inch. The air loosened. The apartment found its ordinary size again. He opened a shoebox and showed me what had not been there yesterday. A hook and eye latch faintly dusted with white paint. 2 matches burned and pinched clean. A child's drawing of a square room with a chair that had more straps than chairs have. He did not ask how. He leaves things when he wants proof, Elliot said. He thinks you like paper. I took a rubbing of the latch with a pencil and my notebook. A detective's compromise with superstition. On the floor near his door, chalk marks had been brushed into the shape of corners trying to be each other. I toed one line apart with the side of my shoe. The chalk gave up easily, and the room exhaled in the smallest way, grateful. When I left, the hallway bulb outside his apartment buzzed and glowed at half its promise. Farther down, a second light burned a sound like a careful footstep paused just at the border, where the nearer bulb failed and the farther one. I did not look into that seam. I let the second light guide me to the stairs, counting to 4 twice as I descended. The shoebox smell of resin following a pace behind, like someone learning my stride. The address came from an insurance form buried in the file, a line of ink that had learned to hide. I drove north before dawn with coffee that cooled too quickly, and a map whose paper refused to warm to my. The highway thinned into back roads, and then into a single ribbon through trees that gathered themselves into a dark, attentive congregation. Maine in late October wears its quiet close. The towns were brief, each with a steeple and a store that sold bait and milk. I counted to 4 twice when the tires clicked over a narrow bridge, and felt the car acknowledge me with a small correction of its own. The house leaned the way Elliot had drawn it, persuaded by a line of pines that pressed their shoulders against its roof. The porch steps sagged. A screen door hung from one hinge as if a story had walked out and forgot to close the door behind it. The yard was a comb of dead grass, and in the middle sat a chair turned toward the trees. I touched it because touching is how I make the world behave. The wood had the smoothness of things that were meant to be handled. On the seat, a faint ring had been rubbed into the grain, the size of a wrist that had forgotten itself. A neighbor appeared the way neighbors do, from nowhere that belongs to them. Her coat was zipped to the chin and her mouth made the shape of someone who had practiced keeping it shut. "You're not buying it," she said. I told her I was a doctor, that I had known the family in a professional way. The lie held only because the house agreed. She looked past me to the threshold, not quite at it. "Don't open the basement," she said. "It breathes funny. We all learn not to look." Inside, dust had adopted the role of witness. A calendar from a decade ago hung with a month that never turned. In the kitchen, a clock surprised me by working, its hands at 2:17 as if time, once satisfied, saw no need to move. The hallway pinched exactly where his pencil had darkened the paper. The door at the end was painted a stiff white that remembered knuckles. I stood with my hand on the knob and felt the metal explain itself. Hook and eye once, then twice, then removed not by tools but by consent. I opened it. The air that came up was colder, but not unfriendly. It had the practiced patience of places designed to store weight. The stairs presented themselves one at a time. On the 3rd, a knot in the wood had been worried into the shape of a coin. On the 7th, chalk dust lingered in the groove as if someone had rubbed lines away and left the apology. At the bottom, the room recognized me as a category, not a person. 4 candle nubs melted into 4 brief pools had permanently stained the concrete at each corner. On the wall where a workbench had been, the paint bore faint figures that were not letters so much as attempts at edges, right angles teaching themselves to kill. The chair was, its leather straps lay in a soft, practiced, ends curled like sleeping caterpillar. I did not sit. I set my palm on the back and counted breaths. The room offered the smell of blown-out matches, cooled wax, pine that had forgotten its branch. I took a photograph with my phone, and the flash returned a pale fog in the corner that refused to be wall or light. When the afterimage cleared, a small object had announced itself on the workbench, a box of strike-anywhere matches with 2 empty graves, where matches used to be. The cover showed a red house with a white door. The door had 2 right angles touching. Something brushed my cuff. I stepped back and looked down. A green filament rested on my shoe, thin as a vein of light. When I pinched it, resin climbed into my nose with the intimacy of a name. I placed the filament in my notebook and closed the cover as if I were tucking in a child. Behind me, soft as a courtesy, 2 metallic pieces found each other, a hook and its eye at the end of a patient day. I counted to 4 twice and left without turning my back to the room. On the porch, the neighbor waited with a jar of buttons, the absurdity of anchoring us both to a harmless world. "He was a polite boy," she said. The father kept to himself. The mother sang without words. She shook the jar once. A small weather. We don't say the shape, she added, and I understood she meant corners. When I thanked her, she looked at my wrists. My sleeves had fallen back. The skin there had flushed to a faint, indecent blush. A ring drawn by no visible pain. I pulled the cuffs down and drove away with the jar's soft rattling living in my ears though I had not taken it, the house keeping its breath while the road unspooled and learned my name. I drove back from Maine under a sky that wouldn't decide its color, the highway unspooling like a vein that had forgotten where it began. On my desk, a thing waited that I had not carried. The matchbox from the basement, the red house with the door made of 2 right angles touching. It lay beside the envelope labeled Pine as if the objects had introduced themselves while I was away. The clock on the shelf had resumed its old certainty. Its hands pointed to 2:17 as though time, having made its point, felt no further obligation. I phoned Elliot and asked him to come at dusk. He arrived early, and I recognized the pallor of someone who has slept beside a room. We took the small room with the frosted window. I dimmed the lamp 1 notch and left the corridor light on, a little amber spine holding the hour upright. He did not sit right away. He walked the perimeter, pausing at each corner like a man greeting neighbors. When he sat, his wrists lay palms up on his thighs with an unearned surrender. He says you found the downstairs, he said, and his mouth made a private, careful smile. He says you stood at the door and learned it. Tell me, I said. He inhaled and held the breath as if it were a coin he wasn't sure he could afford. When I was 7, the chair was a boat and the straps were oars, he said. That's what I told myself. Father drew the corners slow so I could see them gather. He said stillness is how you meet the part that's waiting. He tapped the wall, and the wall answered the way metal answers its match. His eyes fixed past me to the place where the wallpaper repeats its small mistake. He told me I would not have to be 2 if I learned to host the remainder. What remainder? The me that didn't finish leaving, he said, and the room lost a degree that had nothing to do with air. I thought the other boy was a visitor. He was the part of me that stayed downstairs to keep the door propped. When I woke in the yard with sap on my hands, it was because he had come up for air, and I had gone down to hold the hinge. The corridor outside gave a soft metallic meeting, a hook finding an eye, polite and final. I felt the old stiffening along my spine and recited the anchors. Lamp, chair, clock, window, door. The list hesitated, and then completed itself with a 6th that would not give its name. Elliot watched my mouth as if reading a prayer in a language he almost knew. He says corners are how time rests, he whispered. If you bring them together, the day can be one thing long enough to choose. Choose what? Which me gets to keep the breath. He lifted his wrists and lines rose there, clean as the edge of a cup just set down. The skin bloomed to an obedient pink. He says it's my turn to be upstairs. A child's voice counted from somewhere that was not the hall, and not the vent, and not the small speaker in the ceiling we never used. 4, 4, 4, 4. Each arrived like a soft heel striking. The lamp dimmed until the room wore the color of old. Elliot's face altered without changing. The gravity in the bones rearranged. When he spoke, there was a second tone, not a possession. He doesn't like that you move the candles, he said. He says you make rooms forget. I asked who taught the rules first. He breathed out, and the air smelled of candles blown obedient. Father, he said. Mother hummed the time so the house wouldn't slip. He touched the armrest, fingers pressing until the leather creaked. I heard myself cry at the top of the stairs. It was not a memory, it was a neighbor from another hour. The clock stuttered and found itself. 2:17, 2:17, 2:17. We sat inside that single minute the way you sit inside a coat that remembers you. I placed my hands flat on my knees to keep them from speaking. What happens next? I asked. If the corners line. He looked grateful that someone had asked and frightened that someone had. He says the door behind the door opens enough, he said softly. He says one of us steps through with the breath and the other waits where waiting happens. He blinked hard, the way people do when light taps the eye. He says he would like it to be upstairs for a while. The bands on his wrists faded like rings left by cups after the table. He stood and faced the corner with the wallpaper's error and bowed his head, not in piety, but in alignment. The corridor light hummed once, then steadied. Don't turn off your lamp, he said, and his voice was his alone. He wants you to see that the chair can travel. He left the room without looking back. I sat very still and listened to the second door open somewhere inside the hour, a thin, courteous seam of sound that knew my name and did not need to say it. The lamp stayed on in my office through I wrote until the ink thinned and the paper shone faintly. The pen had passed too much. Each line a small excavation. At 2:15 the corridor settled into that particular hospital silence that sounds like a hand cupped over a sleeping mouth. At 2:17 the clock lifted one shoulder and refused to lower it. The second hand trembled and then chose stillness. From somewhere past the door came the courteous metallic meeting I have come to dread. a hook greeting its eye as if nothing could. The nurse on call phoned, then stopped herself mid-sentence. The feed from the quiet room had turned to snowfall. Elliot's bed was a blank country of light. "It isn't out," she said. "It's only thick." I told her to stay in the station. I walked the hall alone because rules are for people who wish to be rescued from their choices. The quiet room smelled of blown candles and resin carried in a coat lining. The camera blinked back to sight as I entered and recorded me discovering what could not have been there. The chair from the basement, exact down to the softened leather and the ring worn into the grain by a wrist that it stood where the room keeps its shadow. The straps lay arranged with a politeness that did not ask. Elliot rested his hands on the arms as if he were a guest at a dinner set for one. He looked relieved, and the relief frightened me more than fear would have. "We can be finished," he said, and the tone under his voice was not a second person so much as the echo of a stairwell answering its own emptiness. "He says the corners have learned each other." He tilted his head toward the ceiling, to the seam where plaster meets tile. Chalk dust quivered there as though someone had just erased a word. "Breathe with," I said, "because it is what I know." We counted to 4 twice. The lamp dimmed on its own to a patient end. The corridor light burned without flicker. Elliot's wrists rose with the slow bloom of a tide, those obedient bands finding their old color. The polite metallic sound came again, nearer, then again inside the room with us. A nesting of closure. I felt the smallest pressure on my forearms, as if straps were considering my skin from a respectful distance. "What happens when the corners line?" I asked. Not because I did not know, but because saying a thing sometimes holds it in the mouth long enough to keep it from happening. "The door behind the door opens just enough," he murmured. "One of us steps through with the breath, and the other waits where waiting happens. He says he has practiced. He says upstairs is kinder now." He glanced at me with a boy's apology. "He wants the light to stay." The air thickened in the way of rooms that are about to remember. Child steps counted to 4 from no particular direction, and stopped right where the wallpaper makes its mistake. Elliot smiled at that empty corner, like a man greeting his own photograph. He inhaled as if accepting a coin, then held it as one holds a vow. The chair creaked with the sound I had heard in Maine, wood and leather agreeing to be patient together. Something brushed my sleeve and left the smell of February trees. I did not touch him. The monitor behind us wrote a calm green sentence, and then chose a clean white page. The timestamp held 2:17 as if time had been folded and pressed, storing a crease. Elliot's chest softened not downward but sideways, like a wave turning its face. The bands on his wrists drained of color. He looked very young for the width of a breath, and then exactly his age, and then not there at all in the way that means still present. The chair remained. The straps lay as they had. The room resumed its square. We wrote it up as elopement because hospitals need a word they can file. Security reviewed corridors that showed no walking. The nurse swore the hall light never dimmed. In my office, the matchbox waited with its red house and right-angled door. Beside it, where the envelope labeled Pine had curled, a hook-and-eye latch rested like a paperweight. I locked my lamp in the on position and thought of a boy counting exactly to 4, stopping where corners. When my patients sit and tell me what silence has asked of them, I sometimes feel the cushion beside my chair yield a little, as if someone tall has leaned down to listen. I do not turn. The clock finds 2:17 more often than math permits. The room keeps its second door. The light stays on.